So I was going to come and do a talk on Amazon Q, but then when I heard Andrea was doing her talk on systems thinking, I, as a systems engineer, decided to pivot on the feedback loop and do my talk on how Q developer fits into the evolving role of the developer. So, by way of intro, I'm the CTO of the partner organization for Asia Pacific and Japan for AWS. I'm also the next gen tech lead. What does that mean? I'm focused on the future problems and what we're seeing now, which very much is with the proliferation of generative AI, how the developer role, the engineering role, the team, the organization, and industry is changing based on what's becoming available in AI-assisted tools as well as agentic architectures. So, this is what I'm going to talk about. I've got about 25 minutes to cram about 2 hours worth of conversation together. So I'm not going to list everything off. I'm just going to jump straight in. How many of you in the audience are developers? 90%, 99% maybe. All right, so how many of you are scared for your job? Is AI going to put you out of a job? Congratulations, developers. You've now been promoted. You're all tech leads. You're not being demoted. You're not going anywhere. Your skill set needs to evolve. So we're going from coding and our traditional practices to a more evolved skill set. What does that mean? So augmented AI is impacting developers at large. So we're leveraging AI tools to enhance our productivity. As the panel said, creativity, cost, all sorts of different areas of the organization are being affected by the use and proliferation of AI assistants and augmented Gen AI tools. I'm clicking. Okay, cool. It's also changing the collaborative dynamics of our organization. It's enhancing the development team as well as departments within the organization, not just between each other, but also between the developer and systems. So now we're having a much more integrated and automated environment of developers with our development systems. I'm going to leave the systems discussion to what Andrea said at the very beginning, because there's a much larger topic on what I mean by our systems, but it could be anything from our DevOps systems, CI/CD, all the way to our organizational operation systems. And so what is this doing? This clicker, there we go. It's providing room for a skills expansion, all right? So the rising influence of AI necessitates a shift of skill set. So now, instead of going and learning different syntaxes and different languages to keep up with coding, now we need to move more to the soft skills and more to the tech lead side of application development. So I can't read that on the screen. You can all read that quote. This is from Swami, who is our new generative AI division lead, VP at AWS. We're moving towards problem solving. So it's less about coding and more about problem solving. All right, so let's take a quick look at the history of the evolution of the developer role. All right, traditionally, as I said before, we've been very focused on manual coding. It's all about syntax. It's all about syntax. Okay, great. That's what I've got in my notes. Extensive debugging, right? So we're looking at our code. It's very much about what we're writing. So logic, syntax, debugging, maybe even unit testing and getting into that side of things. But it's very much about the manual development of code. So preface. When I heard that Andre was doing her speech on systems thinking, this is when I wrote my presentation yesterday. So if I'm looking down at my notes, it's because I literally only wrote it yesterday. So we went from very manual practices. You know, who in the room is as old as me and used to use Vim or, yeah, there we go. Well, great. I'm not the oldest in the room. Perfect. Believe me, I go to a lot of conferences where people have never heard of Vim. So we went from very text-based IDEs to now working within very integrated development environments where we have things like IntelliJ, where we have different tools that allow us to do our dot syntax, so we get additional prompts, and it's making things a lot easier. So we're focusing less on the actual manual coding and more on the logic, more on what we're trying to express in logic, and the IDE itself is helping us with our library understanding and our dot syntax highlighting or our linting and helping us to clean up our code so that's less about syntax and structure and more about logic. And that's where we go now into the shift towards AI integration. So the introduction of AI tools represents a paradigm shift, facilitating smarter development paradigms and collaborative coding. So let's look a little bit at that. I really can't read that. So software development. Okay, so what is software development today? It is everything, everywhere, all at once, which means it's super complex. Like, it's not just about learning a language anymore. I remember going to university, learned 3 languages, came out of university, never used one of them. Had to learn another language as soon as I got out because it wasn't relevant anymore. The pace of change has never stopped. It just keeps getting continuously complex. What does that complexity look like? This is the cloud native landscape. These, at the very top row, most of you will understand all of this. As the developers, we're looking at all of our CI/CD practices, DevOps, all of the different databases that we need to integrate with, all of the different interactions and SDKs and everything that we work with to develop our applications. That's just the top rung. For others in the audience who are also infrastructure engineers and doing other parts of the application development platforms and stacks, you got to move down. And so now we're looking at different tools and different environments and the orange ones and the blue ones and the red ones and, you know, working within an ecosystem that just continuously gets more and more complex. And it's mind-blowing. It's extraneous. We just keep adding complexity. So we can look at the history here of how things have got more complex, from coding or simply just coding and developing logic and applications, moving towards cloud and infrastructure as code, and containers. We just had a talk on Kubernetes and how things are becoming more complex so that more resilient, more secure. These are all considerations that as developers, we now need to think about. It's not just about writing some logic and handing it over. So what has this complexity solved? I'm not going to read through all these, but essentially this is DevOps, right? We've gone from writing code and handing it off to another team and waiting for our infrastructure team to go and procure the infrastructure to run it on. If you're running on premises, then it may have been inserting a new server and then installing onto it, or if it's in the cloud, then waiting for your infrastructure team to provision the infrastructure that your application needs to run on, or if it's your platform for those working on a platform, then the platform team to provision your storage, your services, everything that you need to support the application you're developing. This runs all the way through the DevOps continuum into CI/CD, the different processes that we run to understand scanning, reviews, code practices, into production development, deployment, into operation and monitoring, and then the feedback loops from understanding the emergent behaviors of our applications in production, so using that old language again, productionizing our applications, but it's a system, right? We have to understand how it performs, so that all comes back down to the developer and understanding when we get an emergent behavior or we get some feedback on how something's understand how something's operating, I should say. We as developers need to know, how do we affect it? How do we then redevelop or add a module or fix a bug and move it back into that continuum, that system? That's essentially what all this complexity that we have now has done for us. It's given us a much more, let's say it velocity, a much more hyper-velocitized environment. Now we can ship code within minutes into production, as opposed to the 3 to 6 months that it took to make one small package and get it into production when we were running on a physical server in the IT and ops building, next door. So with all this complexity and everything that we have to be aware of, this is a statistic from I'm not going to even bother. If you can read the small print there, it says where the report is. I get this from Deloitte. I did get this from a Deloitte report. I also got this from a few different reports who do research into understanding the actual time spent for developers in development. If you look at 42 minutes of coding, who here reckons that they do, 4 hours and 21 minutes of coding? Who reckons they do more than that? Yeah, great question. So that's in a week, yeah? So the average person actually does 52 minutes. Average developer does 52 minutes of actual hands-on coding a day. The rest of the time is spent in everything else that I was talking about, the complexity of understanding emergent behavior, of understanding design, and all of the different things that we have to do to build an application, which is not coding. It's just design, build, test, everything else that's required to get it into production and or design and build from scratch. So this talks to the changing skill set of the developer. What are the most important things, or where is the shift going for developers to survive as generative AI and AI assistant tools proliferate more and gain capability? Because we had some great questions to the panel, which I've got some slides coming up, which hopefully that will help address. But it's happening, right? The complexity and the capability of AI is affecting the way that we develop. So how do we stay relevant? Number one, critical thinking development. So modern developers must cultivate critical thinking skills to effectively evaluate the output of generative AI, right? So we're talking vibe coding before. Vibe coding is actually a bit of an anti-pattern where I come from. If you're vibing, you're giving the AI a vibe of what you want to develop, and it gives you a non-deterministic output which has no resilience, no security, no all of the things that we should be building, then you, as the individual developer, need to be able to distinguish those features and build into it, or continue to vibe until you get to that point. And that's going to take a lot longer. If you want to have a conversation around complexity, I ran a group session where we looked at the complexity of vibe coding versus other methods to see where the medium is, where the helpful side is versus when it takes too long to use AI assistance, and as an engineer you could do it yourself in less time. One of the most important things is the importance of systems design. So proficiency in systems design principles is essential for integrating AI solutions with complex software architectures. And I'm sure you all recognize the little icon there to stress the importance, right? Systems thinking is one of the most important skills as a developer moving forward that you can have. Yes, critical thinking is great. We can get to the root cause analysis. But I heard it said in one of the presentations before, I think it was actually Andrea's presentation, the quote around the most important thing in a system is the interactions. Understanding integration, understanding the interactions of a system is where we exist, and developing the integrations between services or back-end database. And we just had a presentation on how to provision or how to migrate data from a Kubernetes environment, right? So these are the integrations and how to move from one environment to another and how different environments are holding data or moving data. One example. And finally, embracing ethical responsibilities. So it's us as developers who need to be aware of the ethical that's a tough word when you're jet lagged, implications of AI usage, right? Not all generative AI output is going to be ethical, yeah? We have guardrails around toxicity, we have guardrails around bias, but if we are using those guardrails, it doesn't mean there's not going to be some kind of ethical issue in the way that we use generative AI. If we're designing an application that is maybe reading personal information from people, how are we using that? Is that ethical? Should we be allowing a generative AI application to read through personal information and derive outputs or suggestions based on somebody's personal information? Probably not. So it's up to us to emphasize the responsible programming and decision making, not up to the AI. And so this is where it's just as important again. So dropped him in there twice. We're moving towards problem solving, not writing code. So developers, I didn't put notes on this one, so I'm going to come over here and have a look at what I put on my slide. So developers are moving much more towards an architectural focus, right? So now we are the tech leads. We're looking at things holistically end to end, as opposed to the modules of code that we're writing to facilitate a specific task. And again, back to the emphasis of integration. It's about how we build our modules of integration, how we integrate within our environments, how we create systems and subsystems within that environment is the more important thing, all going back to the holistic nature of systems and systems thinking. All right. So the question came up before around vibe coding, right? How many of you have heard of the term flowgramming? One. Awesome. Because I told you last night? Yeah, cool. Anyone else? All right, so I didn't coin this phrase. This is Dr. Pete. Everyone know Dr. Pete Solansky? Was AWS, then moved to Microsoft, is now running his own SI. Okay, so he coined this not long after vibe coding was coined. And the difference represents, when we're talking about vibe coding, we're talking about natural language programming, right? So we're talking about, here's my vibe, go and build me an application to do blah, blah, blah. When we talk about flowgramming, we're talking about agentic workflows, so flow of agents. As an example, the clicker's not working again. There we go. Here's an example of flowgramming, right? So I ask, this is QCLI for those of you who are interested. So we have QCLI, IDE, there's a few different ways of using it, but the idea here is, in the CLI, I can give it a vibe and say, I want you to go and build this, and it'll just start running around and building it. And it's a single LLM using a very limited chain of thought with a very somewhat limited context window, right? So it's only a small amount that it can actually achieve. When we get into flowgramming, this is what we call spec-driven development. So now we're actually designing up front. This is everything that I want to design and develop. It's still natural language, but it's more towards that tech lead, more towards that architectural side, where we're describing to the agent what we want to build in a spec, and then allow a workflow of agents, multiple agents, to run through. They will create their own chain of thought, own to-do list for each agent to then pick up. That one might be a coder, if coding is the output that you're looking for. Another one will be review. Another one will be focused on security. We have multiple agents all working together to develop an end-to-end application, the holistic application of what we're asking from the spec. This is moving towards, instead of the big LLM, be-all, end-all that, the Lord of the Rings style Sauron LLM, this is the very specific, we're calling them, obviously everyone's heard of the term small language model. So a distilled model that has a very specific domain. So if we have a coding model, if we're saying I want to build it in Java, then I wouldn't have a big LLM that can do every language. I would have a Java model that's specific to Java. Less chance of hallucination, more chance of accurate output. But then also, because it's a chain of thought working with multiple agents, I'll have another review agent, which is reviewing the code output of the other agent. So it's now taking an entire development team, shrinking them down to electronic agents, and putting them in the computer. So now we can do the same amount of work that a team would do in 3 to 6 months in 10 minutes. So this is why I'll leave it. I've got 7 minutes left, so I'm going to leave it for a conversation if anyone wants to come up and have more of an argument and conversation style around the difference between flowgramming and vibe coding, and how do we achieve these things in terms of each agent has its own context window and what we can do. And there's a whole lot we can discuss here around the shift to problem solving, right? So now spec-driven development, we're actually designing what we want up front. Anyone heard of Raphael? Okay, awesome. Raphael is one of our, in the States, actually in Italy, one of our generative AI product owners. So he does a lot of research into generative AI. He came up with this, what we're calling the point-in-time view. So it's a model of AI assistance adoption, understanding, in this case, from a vibe coding point of view, you want to be, so you on the bottom line are the developer where it says you are here, right? At the top line is the generative AI assistant that you're using. So Q developer, hopefully, for those of you who are on AWS. There's a point where there's stuff that you already know, and so there's going to be a productivity boost in terms of allowing the assistant to help you fulfill the undifferentiated heavy lifting, yeah? You can get through and build without having to worry about what it's building, because you know it, it's your corpus of knowledge. However, there's, on the other side, there's the stuff you don't know. And so there's an area where it will help you learn, whether it's a new language, a new syntax, a new paradigm. It can help you learn because it exists within the open source corpus of knowledge, so it's available for you to tap into. However, as you start to stretch the line out further into more complexity, so we're trying to start We're trying to build things that are way more complex. I have a background in defense and aerospace as a distributed and embedded systems engineer, so a lot of algorithms, a lot of ciphers. A lot of the stuff that I used to do, if I try and vibe code it, it will absolutely fail, hands down every time, because it's not in the open source corpus of knowledge. All right, I've got 5 minutes to then cover off how everything comes together. So we are developers, right? I think I've heard a few times the talk around interaction between different parts of the organization. So now we're talking about how developers are interacting more with designers. Did I get it right? Woohoo, designers. All right, so we're now working with the product designers who maybe aren't so technical, but it's the product owners of your organization, or the designers who are actually trying to design a solution based on the business requirements. As we start to evolve as developers, we need to move more away from just focusing on the coding and everything that I've said before with those soft skills and understanding systems, and more towards the collaborative state between the roles that we interact with. That also includes the services, especially from an organization where a lot of what I do is handed to me as a service, and I need to interact with these people to understand how we develop solutions and applications on top of those services, abstractions on top. The most important part for us as developers is not to focus on just the interaction between, say, me and a designer because I kind of like design, or me and the product owners because I kind of like how that product works, but it's the middle point where we, as developers, can pick up the skills required to interface and interact with the designers, with the product owners. The more we shift to the center, the more relevant we become, because we can fit within the team as like DevOps did for development, testing, production, deployment, everything, bringing it all into as one team. Now we're moving everything into one role. We do a little bit of everything. Obviously, not everyone can do a little bit of everything, but the more we can shift into that, the more responsibility and capability we will have to remain relevant. Okay, so this is a view of the SDLC with the team on the inside. So we understand that there are multiple members within a team and how they operate. I've got 3 minutes, so I'm not going to go through and explain every step of the SDLC, but you're all developers, so you understand it. So what is Q? So Amazon Q, I don't like how marketing put it, the most capable generative AI-powered assistant. I use a whole lot of tools. I don't just use Q. I use my blue friends tools, and I use my red friends tools, and I use a whole ecosystem of tools. But at the same time, they're all doing the same thing, right? They're all facilitating that integration between all the different members of the team, because now they're giving me the capability to understand what is it that my design counterpart is doing? What is it that my architect counterpart is doing? What is it that my operations counterpart, my testing counterpart is doing by able to have a conversation with the conversational agent, or to be able to develop a spec and say, all right, I need you to just go and build this application. I don't know, and I'm not a UI designer. I'm the worst when it comes to front end, right? But it doesn't matter anymore, because I can build a spec and say what framework I want it in, how I want it to look, and I've got agents who can do that for me. Again, 1.5 minutes, so I'm not going to step through every single task, but if you take a look at this before I jump to the next slide, this is generally the types of tasks that we do at each step within the SDLC. And to the side, or just above each step, I've got here an example of what part of Q you might be using to interact with to achieve each and every one of those tasks. So I can now use the AI assistant tools to do most of the SDLC for me instead of having that entire team. And especially when we are not vibe coding, we're moving towards an agentic workflow, so a flowgramming. I can do twice as much in half the amount of time, but be assured that it's not going to be a toxic output or a hallucinated output, because we're developing and we're refining the agents that we use within our agentic workflows. So yes, vibe coding, bad practice. Flowgramming, on the other hand, is where I see everything is going. I'm going to skip this one because all this is showing you is, this is the dashboard when you're using Q. This would have been relevant if I could have said half of my talk, but I've got half a second. So what skills matter most? I'm going to click through this very quickly. These are the skills that matter most to us as developers. It's the creativity in development. So understanding from a holistic point of view, what are we building and how do we fit inside the environment to then build out the architecture, the holistic application end to end. It's the abstraction skills. So developers must embrace abstraction. All right, so everything that we do is an abstraction on the last generation. I'm going to say generative AI in a few years won't go from natural language to code. Why would it? Because it's just an abstraction. Why wouldn't we go straight from natural language to bytecode or natural language to assembly? If we are cutting out the middle layer, then we actually have the ability to develop everything that we need and allow the AI to develop, to the actual underlying part for us. And now, the most important skill, I really suck at this, is empathy and understanding. So for those of you who don't know, I'm ASD and ADHD, and that means that I really don't get empathy or sarcasm for that matter. But understanding, like being able to put yourself in other people's shoes and understanding what they get out of a product and how they use a product and what they need is one of the most important soft skills as a developer moving forward that we can have. Because it's now not just about designing the functional task that we're given, it's about understanding who's going to interact with this, how are they going to interact with this, so developing something that is usable by the end user, by us developers, and not maybe the entire team where we have a UX and UI designer who have done that for you. Finally, last slide, future outlook. So current focus, 2020s, we're starting to adopt AI assistance. We're starting to learn the goods and the bads, the anti-practices and the practices, vibe coding versus flowgramming. There are more things coming that I really wish I could talk to you about, but stay tuned for reInvent because there are some cool announcements coming. 2030s is where we get to integrated workflow as developers, as we bring on these soft skills and we understand how to work with our AI assistants, and it's not just like getting rid of the developer environment, as in we need to start training up those graduates from university to start understanding systems thinking, understanding architectural patterns and practices, not just writing code, so that by the time they get experience and exposure across all their projects, they step up as the tech lead. And they're there to coordinate and orchestrate between the AI agentic systems. So it becomes an integrated and autonomous workflow between human and AI. And the important thing is, code less, think more. It's about the soft skills now, less about the actual writing code. Thank you. If anyone is interested in playing with Q, although I didn't talk much about Q, scan the QR code, that'll give you a builder ID, and it's free, so you can go and play with it. It won't set up an account, AWS account for you, it's just for Q. Otherwise, thank you for your time.